right, well, I guess I can do the introduction then. So I had the pleasure of watching Ben and Stephen present during both their midterm and final design review for the Life Do Grow farm, which is an urban farm in Philadelphia near Temple. And it was just a really fascinating project that they got to work on with the CDC. And I felt like it would be a really great opportunity for everyone here to listen in and get to see their design process and how that worked with urban creators who are the owners of Life Do Grow Farm. So without further ado, I'll let Stephen and Ben take the wheel.
Sure. Thank you, Christina. It's nice to meet everybody. Let me just share the screen here. So we sent Christina, I don't know if you got the email, it was kind of late last night, the PDF version of this. So if you want to share it with the folks here today afterwards, that's totally fine with us.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So we are, well, I am Stephen Panasci. I'm a landscape architect. I'm currently working at Robitaille Curtis in Montreal, but I had been running my own practice, Agrario Design, in New Jersey in the Philly area for the last several years, and will still continue to use it for events like this and things like that.
Yeah, and I'm Ben Willis. I'm an architect with Union Studio. We're an architecture and community design firm, actually headquartered in Providence, Rhode Island, but we have a Philly satellite office that I run here. And Stephen and I met this past year on, as Christina said, at a community design collaborative grant involving Life Do Grow Farm. And so we hope today to be able, we'll talk a little bit about Life Do Grow, but we're hoping to talk to sort of more broadly about this conversation that's starting to expand around kind of design and urban ag. So this is just a quick roadmap of where we're going. And this will be admittedly a non-exhaustive presentation. So there's a lot of things that we're just going to touch briefly on, but again, hopefully this is some good food for thought.
Yeah, and we're hoping to keep the presentation not super long, so there's lots of time for kind of discussion and questions. And the last bullet point there, or the second to last, the where do we go from here, I think is a big part of today's talk.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right. So when we talk about urban ag, what exactly are we talking about? And maybe more importantly, why should architects and landscape architects care about this? At its most basic, obviously, it's an integral part of the physical solutions in our cities that promote health and well-being, which is closely tied to, I think, our mission and calling as architects. Next slide. But when we talk about it, we are talking more than just kind of raised bed gardens. We mean the practice of cultivating, processing, and distributing food in or around urban areas. So this will include horticulture, but also aquaculture and urban beekeeping, and the ways that all of that produce and food gets from the farm to consumers. Next slide. And we tend to think about food here as an end and as a means to an end, specifically towards communication and connection with the earth and with one another, opportunities for education and sovereignty, which is a concept that we'll talk about with Life Do Grow. Next slide. And we think it's really a necessary element in a resilient city. Philadelphia is working on an urban agriculture plan so that they can better understand how this functions within the city. And I think by resilient, we mean both climate resiliency and also human resiliency, sort of a more just environment. And the map on the right here, you'll see a blow up of, which is created by Soil Generation and Interfaced Studios for an article in WHYY, shows the overlay of urban farms in Philadelphia against the high concentration poverty areas in Philadelphia. And you can see a strong coexistence between the two right now. But importantly, this map on the left shows the overlay of recent development permits in the city. So these urban ag spaces are intersecting with development And there are quite a few debates going on about whether agriculture even belongs in the city, or sort of what the highest and best use of land in the city is. But we think there's a balance, and that this really demands our creativity as designers and our advocacy as citizens. So to that end, we wanted to just touch base on a few broad insights from our experience designing urban agriculture. And the first is, of course, to listen to the community and what they need, both in direct conversations with the people who will eventually or are currently stewarding the land, but also in indirect observations about food access, culture of the place, and the health outcomes that are currently happening in that neighborhood. Second are all the sort of physical considerations that go into site selection. When we think about urban ag, at least for me, I tend to think of like a sort of whole block vacant lot that's turned into some kind of a farm, but it can really work well on the sort of interstitial spaces between buildings. And if you get creative about sort of what you're doing with your roof space, or what you're doing with the kind of median area between your building and the public realm, you can find opportunities to integrate it at smaller scales too. And then the zoning and land use policies obviously have a big impact on agriculture, and not just, can we legally grow food here, but can we sell that food here if we wanted to host a pop-up market? And if we can't sell it here, where can we sell it, or who is going to sell it, and where is that going to be to go from this space? And then also, what kind of structures are we allowed to put up to support the farm needs, and who owns the land, who is really responsible for it at the end of the day?
Yeah, and moving on to plant selection, it may seem like a small detail that typically comes kind of at the end of the project, or maybe the users decide, but I think it's an integral part of the conversation process with these communities. Oftentimes in urban agriculture, you're working in lower income communities with lots of immigrants possibly, or kind of marginalized communities. So it's extremely important to listen to them about not only how they want to use their land, but what they actually want to do with it. So culturally relevant diet planning is a huge part of that. Not all urban agriculture is raised bed community gardens where everyone has their own plots. Sometimes they're more communal. So that input is very important. And then the use of native plants in our cities. Part of this is for beautification and restoring ecological habitat, but there's also cultural significance with a lot of native plants through the Afro-Indigenous community, Native American communities that are still very much present on the land, as you'll see with the Life Do Grow farm. And there's other uses besides just food for a lot of plants, like fiber and dye and medicine or whatever else.
And in terms of sort of using a light touch, I think we think about design of these spaces in a way that's very flexible and thinking about incremental progress, but also changing the paradigm about how we approach land, and thinking of it as a sort of balanced approach where we are both giving and receiving, rather than a purely extractive paradigm.
And then the final point is the urban environment as the commons. So this is a kind of a idea that's been gaining traction through the kind of sustainable farming and sustainable food movement for a while now, but I think it's especially important in urban environments. So kind of tie the last bullet point of sovereignty in with the first one that Ben talked about, of listening to the neighborhood, is extremely important in listening to how people see land use within their own neighborhood. That's not a top-down kind of city mandated or zone thing, but what would people do with land if they were just in complete control of it? Whether or not they actually own it, there's lots of other options for short and long-term leases, partnerships with private organizations, whatever it may be. But maintaining sovereignty, maintaining a voice for the community with what happens on that land is just an extremely important part of social justice, environmental justice, and can greatly kind of impact the community in very tangible ways, such as like actually owning the wealth of whatever the agricultural system is that they're producing, or if they are fortunate enough to own the land or be able to acquire it, there's obviously a lot of wealth generation associated with that. So you'll see that issue come up.
Yeah. So we've got 3 projects to quickly touch on that should hopefully illustrate some of those points. The first is Life Do Grow, which is an incredible 3-acre plot in North Philadelphia. It's part of the Lenni Lenape Hokum, and was traditionally an indigenous farm that became a colonial farm, that became a warehouse and ice production facility in the 19th century. Those buildings were torn down and has been vacant for about 50 years. But next slide. Back in 2010, some students and neighborhood activists and artists who lived nearby really wanted to find a way to do something better with the land, but really to build relationships with one another. So they started growing food in a small portion of it, and then providing youth activities and mentorship around that food growth. And over the last 12 years have built a neighborhood collective that's grounded both in sort of radical imagination, not just of this space, but sort of radical imagination more broadly, and these 6 pillars here on the right. Next slide. So they've had a 10-year lease from the city land bank for this land, and over that time they've been able to put up some incredible murals, some farm structures, and grow food that they sell at markets both there and around the city year round. Now they have a pretty significant greenhouse presence. And this neighborhood is considered a food desert. So Life Do Grow feels like an oasis, not just because they're providing food, but also because they are providing this verdant sort of green space that when you're on the farm, it's amazing. You can hear wildlife, and it feels like a sort of quiet rural space right in the middle of the city. And while the farm is really at the heart of it, there were these other spaces that developed around. It became really sort of equally definitive to their mission. Gardening beyond the walls of the farm, and gathering spaces for the neighborhood, and opportunities for people who make things maybe beyond stuff that's grown on the farm to sort of get together and mentor one another. So the vision plan that the CDC helped them with really looks ahead to enhancing the multi-purpose gathering spaces, the learning and entrepreneurship spaces, and helps them physically emphasize their presence in the neighborhood, while also encouraging them, as Stephen said, to grow more sort of native and Afro-Indigenous plants that reflect the culture. So I think the takeaways from this project are that sovereignty is critical. Go to the next slide there. Urban farms provide a space for a community to tell their own story, both in words and in the soil. And that we should really consider how urban ag spaces become spaces for people to grow. Again, these communities that form because this becomes a neighborhood hub.
Great. So the next project we'll look at of the 3 is the Ryder Farm at Westside High School in Newark, New Jersey. I was fortunate to be involved with this project. The principal you see on the right has gained quite a bit of popularity throughout the country. He's been on Ellen and Oprah at times, kind of promoting some of the programs he does at the school, mainly focused on what he calls the Lights On program. The school is in an extremely kind of dangerous neighborhood in Newark. There's a lot of violent crime. There's a lot of extremely high rates of poverty. And for a long time, the school was dealing with all kinds of issues of some of that violence coming to the school, as well as extremely low attendance records because of problems at home and things like that. And the principal just decided he was going to start changing that by it started with he got laundry machines put in the basement so students can come and have clean clothes, which was a big factor for why a lot of them weren't coming to school. Actually, they were kind of embarrassed and things like that. So he said, no, we're going to take care of that. And then the Lights On program is basically several nights a week. The school is open till 11 p.m. for students to just kind of use. They can use the music room, they could play in the gym, they could do their homework, they can use the arts rooms, whatever they want. They could just hang out, or they could do something more productive. But the idea is to give them a safe space. So his big idea was to have a farm on the campus to kind of bring a lot of this programming outside, tie it with educational components. And a big thing they do at the school is focus on entrepreneurship in all things that they do. So in the music program, they're also focusing on music production. How do you promote yourself as a musician? How do you actually work as these things rather than just the idea of learning them for the sake of learning them. So we started with a process with the school of kind of surveying students at some of these nights of the Lights On program and figuring out what kind of foods they'd want to see, what kind of things they'd want to do with the spaces. You can see the word clouds up here were kind of the results of our surveys of the main things they wanted to grow, eat, and do at the farm. Some images. So, it is a high school with a big formal front lawn, currently nothing going on. And then there's this gymnasium expansion that you can see in the photo on the right, where there's this like very horribly maintained parking lot that needs to go and some more green space. And this area is actually very protected by a gate. So part of the planning was to build this farm on the campus. So you can see planting an orchard in front of the school on the left side there with native plants and wildflowers underneath, and then a whole farm compound on the right, which kind of supports, the majority of the activity of the farms. This is where we have raised bed gardening. There's a hydroponic greenhouse being built. This is where markets would happen, food processing, cold storage, all these kinds of things, plus outdoor classrooms and space for the students to kind of use on on a regular basis, as well as engage the community. And it's very important that this project, through the principal's eyes, was not just kind of a typical schoolyard farm where the students come out and they learn a little bit and do a little bit of weeding, and then eventually the teachers kind of get burnt out and the project fails, which is kind of the story of a lot of school farms. So he was very adamant that this is a working farm that just happens to be on the campus. And the students get to be involved with it. So there's a hired full-time farmer. It's connected with neighborhood nonprofit organizations that connect urban farms in Newark, as well as bringing in food from the New Jersey kind of countryside from organic farms. So the farm will also function as a food distribution hub. So the students will be able to learn everything from how to grow the plants to how to, do processing and added value like hot sauce or honey or jams, and then how to market those things and create and partner with little businesses in Newark. So it's very focused on like this idea of vertical integration with the students, as well as just giving them opportunities to economically succeed and show them that, how many avenues there are within what a farm, which is typically used on schools to show, environmental science and nutrition, but it can be so much more than that.
Yeah. And the last project is the Southside Community Land Trust. They're a 40-year-old organization based in Providence that began when a group of Hmong immigrants couldn't find their native produce in the local grocery stores, but did find that they were sort of surrounded by vacant lots in South Providence, decided to start growing that produce on those lots. It did really well. And now 40 years later, the organization has a full-time staff of about 14 people, and they help steward about 70 acres, including a number of urban farms and sort of suburban farms immediately around Providence. But as they've been growing, particularly in the past 10 years or so, what they found is that the farmers have been able to accumulate more sort of growing space, but they're facing this challenge wherein the infrastructure to get that produce from the ground to the market, to consumers, to restaurants, meaning dry and cold storage, production space, a sort of a commercial kitchen, all of that infrastructure is technical and expensive. And so rather than replicate that for each individual, Southside wanted to create a hub where they could share those needs and really increase their distribution capacity and lower the bar of entry to new farmers. So this couple years ago, they acquired an 1850s livery building that's adjacent to their youth farm lot. And they're now converting it into a 12,000 square foot office space and a production storage facility. If you go to the next slide, there's a plan that shows the sort of the produce packaging and commercial kitchen and storage spaces there on the left that will provide a hub for farmers sort of across the city to use that space without having to do it on their own. And then they're also creating these small tenant spaces that will allow food production businesses to have space to do what they might want to do before they sort of scale up and have their own facility. And that tenant D there on the right is going to be a market that provides fresh produce for the neighborhood, which is also a food desert, much like where Life Do Grow is in North Philadelphia. So the takeaways here, again, are really that food can be a means of community building. And in this case, community of farmers and community of growers, in addition to the neighborhood, that kind of meet at this hub. But it's also, there are questions about how land stewardship and land ownership of these vacant lands gets handled. And urban ag can bring ecologic and economic value to the neighborhood, but we need to sort of figure out the organizational structures around keeping that in the community and then helping the community scale up when and if they want to.
So we wanted to show those 3 projects to just, kind of be examples of how different each urban agriculture project can be. There's common threads like we discussed, but there's also a lot of nuance to them. And, this slide being more general, I won't get into every single little detail of it. It's meant to kind of inspire discussion. But I think the big takeaway Ben and I have discussed is, as designers, we tend to think of like very tangible physical infrastructure of like vertical farms, hydroponics, aquaculture, whatever it may be, as the new thing that's going to solve like our food system. And what we just keep coming back to is like, all those things are great, but they're all just one piece of the puzzle. Like the physical design of the actual farm, of the actual infrastructure, is just one part of what we're trying to do in fixing food systems, and that there's all these other components that in some things we can as designers impact, especially from maybe more of a planning and land use view, but there's also a lot of partnerships that just need to be fostered, and there's a lot of some things that are kind of out of our control, like kind of trends over time. So the first bullet point of one thing we think has really affected the food system is what suburbs have done, honestly, to kind of like the regional planning of a lot of America, which is separating cities further from the rural kind of productive landscapes of agricultural and ecological resources, by having this huge, green belt be replaced. And that simultaneously happened in our history while our food system was industrializing, and we were creating this race to the bottom policy with like grow commodity crops, don't grow diverse foods, the creation of factory farms, all those things. And those, we can't necessarily fix all of those as designers, but I think it's a part of the conversation that we need to be able to talk about and address in some way. And then, so in the suburbs, we have this massive explosion of lawns and sterile landscapes. Just around Philadelphia and New Jersey, there's so many office parks with just these giant expanses of lawn that just get mown, and there's nothing happening there at all. It's not public land, but it's land that possibly could be used. And one thing, I like to talk about is, as landscape architects, there's a trend growing towards ecological landscapes, which is absolutely necessary, of restoring meadows and woodlands and stormwater infrastructure. But I think we should add agriculture as kind of a land cover strategy to start putting back in some of these places to make them productive again.
Yeah, and just thinking too about sort of reconnecting regional economies and regional networks of food systems, so we can sort of stitch back together an understanding of where we're getting our food, where our food is coming from, and trying to sort of localize that in a way that is also sustainable and scalable, because that, if we can reduce the amount of transportation that your strawberry goes to from where it was grown to where you're putting on your plate, that's going to help mitigate much of our sort of climate woes around agriculture. And it's also going to sort of re-energize a lot of the natural systems that have come out of balance with our development patterns over the last 100 years.
Yeah, and you know, so a big part of, I think, the sovereignty aspect, just to kind of wrap that back into what Ben just mentioned with the regional economies, is just to put you know, the kind of situation in the hands of the people that are interacting with lands in cities, or maybe it's in the suburbs, or, you know, to connect this system, but to make sure that the people working in the system are owning the system and benefiting financially from it, and that it's a sustainable financial endeavor. And that, you know, there's a lot of social justice and racial justice issues to address with that in our agricultural system. And like planning in our cities has, you know, it's an opportunity to start tying a lot of these things together to have kind of this intersectional movement. And so we just wanted to wrap up just a few resources, some of the organizations we worked with from the project, so the Urban Agriculture Cooperative, the Urban Creators, and the Southside Community Land Trust. The Altogether Now PA is about kind of agricultural and planning in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then a few books and kind of resources on sustainable farming and kind of some stories about the food system. That's what Pastoral Song is, just kind of like the history of it. And then some resources of people trying to fix things in a very ambitious way. And thank you. So now we'd like to open up for questions and discussion, and we can go back to any slides that people would like.
Well, first, thank you guys so much for joining. I just had one question, or maybe a comment about the word resiliency. I feel like it's become a really big buzzword in architecture, and it's always viewed in a very positive light. But during my urban agriculture certificate program, the discussion came up that being resilient isn't actually always a positive thing, because it's putting the onus on the person to persevere through situations that they themselves did not necessarily put themselves in, and that if they don't, that's their own fault. So I wonder, how can we start to change the dialogue from resilience to maybe a more inclusive word? Or I'm not sure like how what this connotation means and how that might impact how people view urban agriculture and these sorts of ideas.
It's an interesting question, and I appreciate that. I think you're right that it has become a buzzword that's almost starting to lose its sense of meaning. But in terms of the conversation around urban ag, I wonder if there's a difference between sort of the resiliency of systems versus the resiliency of people. And if we think about the sort of making the systems more resilient, I guess what I think is like having those systems have more capacity to handle when things don't go as we expect, having a couple of routes to get from point A to point B, and really providing support for people along the way when those unexpected things happen. I feel like that's where kind of agriculture can support that. And if we can build those systems up, then maybe individuals themselves don't need to be as resilient, if you will, because the onus is not going to fall on them as much as, you know, they'll have the system to rely on. I don't know if that.
Yeah, and I think one thing to go along with that is what's happening slowly, but cities are starting to get more supportive of the urban agriculture efforts of people in their cities. So like the Life Do Grow project, for example, in Philadelphia, they are acquiring some of the land, like in kind of conversation with the city, which is a huge deal. That changes everything for them about what they're able to build and do and plan long term, and the money they're able to raise, knowing that they'll have a space to actually use it. In Newark, one thing that's happening, the Urban Agriculture Cooperative is kind of banding together with a lot of the urban farmers to petition the city, basically, as development pressures rise, for the people that have been kind of using city-owned lots. They have a adopt a lot program where you can basically lease it extremely, like for $1 a year, you know, for garden purposes, to get a first crack at proposing a new use so that they can kind of say, okay, well, if it can't be exactly our garden anymore, but maybe we can turn it into an education center where we can maintain the garden. Maybe we could do affordable housing development where a garden is part of it. So it's giving the people kind of like the first stab at development proposals and connecting them with people who can kind of give them the money. So I think that, to your point about like, you know, people are in situations that are of no fault of their own. I think that's where the partnerships with like government and NGOs and things like that have to really step in to like make that system function for these people so that's not all on their backs.
Well, Ben and Stephen, thank you so much for the presentation.